Hill University, Shillong. He also directs research programs in international relations. He holds a PhD and MPhil in international relations from JNU and masters from Delhi University. He has attended advanced international program in conflict resolution at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, Sweden. Very renowned university in peace and conflict studies. And also School of Peace and Studies Conflict Transformation course conducted by Amman and Bayap University, Thailand, focusing on conflict analysis and prevention, peace building, understanding peace in the local, regional, and international level. His academic contributions are immense. He has contributed a lot in the field of academics by writing in several international reputed journals, and also published 2 books already. So I will not be going into the details of his write-ups, which comes to a very long list. I would simply make it short by saying that his area of interest are ranges in the politics in general and international relations and comparative politics. And he has particular research interest in India's foreign policy, China studies, South and Southeast Asia studies, Indian politics, and Northeast studies. So we are indeed very privileged to have you, sir, today in this webinar to take on the topic security challenges of the United Nations. Before I hand over the time to our resource person, I would just make this few announcement that it is a lecture. Nevertheless, we will give time for discussion after the lecture is over. So if you have any queries, doubts, or if you have any comments, you can take time after the lecture is delivered. So we will not interrupt our speaker while he delivers his lecture. You can also send queries in the chat box or raise your hand in the discussion hour during the discussion period. So, and I remind you once again to keep your microphone off when the session is conducted. So over to you, sir. Your microphone is muted, sir.
Yeah. At the outset, I must thank Dr. Phimantang for saying some nice words about me. Although as teachers, it's our duty to engage our audience for some kind of a deliberation discussion. I must also express my gratitude to the Political Science, Political Science Association in Fazal Ali College and the principal and staff of Fazal Ali College, Mokokchung, for having taken time out to organize a program on a very important topic and on an important institution called United Nations. And I'm also particularly happy that this college could take a lot of efforts to celebrate the day where the whole humanity should be able to rejoice rather than regret the contribution of United Nations. As we will see through the lecture, how the UN structure has been there and how the UN has been able to contribute to the current peace and security, and how the world has become safer, despite the criticism that the United Nations probably is not doing much or is not doing as much as it is expected by the world community. But nonetheless, we'll see that primarily because of the United Nations as a global international organization, the human race, it will not be wrong to say that it has survived rather than has faced the kind of devastation which people faced during the First Cold War, during the First World War, or during the Second World War. So when you're talking of Second World War, we remember that United Nations is primarily post Second World War organization. It was creation after the Second World War came to an end. And this particular day that UN tends to celebrate its foundation day, 24th October 1945, is particularly written in the golden word simply because it is the day where UN Charter came into force after more than 50 countries, member countries have ratified the United Nations Charter in their respective national parliament and agreed to become part of the United Nations. And then that is how on 24th October, the UN Charter came into force. So that is how we find that this United Nations is a kind of a post-Second World organization, which we will see that what has been its contribution as per our own establishment of peace and security is concerned. And also in the second part, we will see what are the global challenges and how UN has been able to tackle it or not tackle it, and what are the reasons as to why United Nations has not been functioning to the expectation of the people, and also how and what would be the future roadmap for United Nations if it has to continue to be functional as has been the hopes and aspirations of billions of people in today's world. I think the United Nations Day is also celebrated for the simple reason that UN Day also tends to offer opportunity to amplify the common agenda of peace and security, which has been the kind of a crying, which has been the cry of the population who saw the kind of devastation that took place in the whole world, and how certain countries tend to have come for almost extinction because of the dropping of the nuclear bomb, and still today we see that the people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima tend to undergo the discomforts, or as you call it, the kind of crisis that they face because of the dropping of the nuclear bomb. And here, I think, when you talk about common agenda, we know that UN Day also tends to be celebrated to reaffirm the purposes and principles of the UN Charter over the last 76 years. The very fact that UN has existed for the last 76 years certainly goes to the credit of UN that it has been able to live up to the expectations of the people. It is not very easy to live up to every expectation of every section of the population in the world, but nonetheless, given the fact it has continued for the last 76 years, it shows that how much vital role it must have played in the context of our own world, which seems to be torn with everyday conflicts. And when you talk of conflicts, we know conflicts tend to be diverse in nature, and every day that when we get up from the sleep, we find that conflicts are not only they've changed quantitatively because of the increasing number of conflicts. We also find that they have also such conflicts which involve human beings and states tend to have also undergoing changes qualitatively as well. So that way, when the world is torn with conflicts, we will see that how United Nations and what kind of structure that the UN the founders of the United Nations tend to have gone forward with, and which has really contributed towards such long existence of United Nations. We know when you talk of the existence of United Nations, we need to remember, although this was not the first international organization which was preceded by League of Nations, but League of Nations did not stay longer simply because it had to go away within a decade. But for the fact that UN has been there for such a large number of years, it shows that how the UN Charter, which tends to reflect the common aspirations of the people, tend to have been carried out with due honesty and integrity, and which has also contributed towards the, if we like to say, lessening of tensions that are normally present in our own daily behavior, be it involving the states or be it involves the people who tend to be leaders of various countries in today's world. We know that the UN Charter over the last 76 years tend to have strengthened the international cooperation for which the United Nations was set up, and also it has been functioning in the interest of both nations and also the people in order to ensure them a more peaceful and a prosperous future. Today, if we are able to think of various scientific innovations, various political machinations, which tends to get translated into the so-called development processes, which tend to have made various countries very, very economically rich. That's solely because of the ensuring of the peace and security. Countries tend to be prospering as we see in our own lifetime. So, it has to be also remembered that this year the UN's theme, that UN has adopted a theme for its own celebration of Foundation Day is building back together for peace and security. So in the why we talk of this theme, simply because that it shows that the United Nations in all its activities tend to emphasize broadly on the question of peace and security, which is not only important for the states and also states which are members of the United Nations, and also for the peoples at large. And that is where we find that the UN, which was created in 1945, tend to have followed, as we said, unheard. That in today's era of globalization, we are an interconnected world. Anywhere any conflict taking place certainly is going to get so much accentuated that all of us willy-nilly may get dragged into any kind of a conflict which may be taking place as far as Africa or as far as Pacific Ocean. So that shows because of the effect of globalization, because of the fact that this era is now where the news are being brought to our home, where everybody tends to get almost energized by looking at the negative things which are happening to certain sections of the people with whom we may have had either social, economic, or political contact. That way, prevention of the conflict tends to have become kind of a utmost responsibility for the United Nations, where where diplomacy fails, if they suddenly come to the brink of war, the peacekeepers are also deployed by the United Nations in order to see that the conflicts are controlled to the minimum that it can be and it should be at any given time. And we know, so increasingly, we know that if UN has been deploying these tactics as per the UN Charter, we know that United Nations these activities tend to, although they tend to be taken at different form, but we should remember that these activities also often tend to overlap each other. Whether it is the question of carrying on diplomacy or the question of sending the UN Secretary General's deputed by UN Secretary General and his own representatives to the field to carry on some kind of diplomatic negotiation with the involved parties, or it is diplomatic peacekeepers, they all seem to be almost overlapping each other, because each one of the measure tends to not be taken in isolation from each other. It tends to contribute and tend to get interconnected with the other measures which are provided by the United Nations Charter. We also know that in the United Nations, we have read in our own studies that even against any other state, the UN Security Council tends to have been empowered to call upon the various parties to parties to the dispute for the pacific settlement of the disputes, rather than resort to any kind of a war. And we find when we talk of UN Security Council, we know as per the UN Charter, Chapter 7 of UN Charter tends to empower UN Security Council to undertake various measures in order to prevent any act of aggression or any act which is likely to breach peace between any state, between any two states, or between any group of states. And that is where we find, it tends to talk of collective security, where UN Security Council has been authorized by the UN Charter to undertake such measures as imposing economic sanctions, economic sanctions including the international military actions, in order to prevent any breakout of war which could be threatening the so-called peace that is prevailing in any particular situation. So here also we find that same in addition to imposing sanctions, UN Security Council can also establish UN peacekeeping missions and also can send special political missions in order to ensure that peace and order is maintained, tranquility is not threatened, and the war of aggression doesn't take place. And when you talk of this UN Charter, it's very interesting to see that at least these measures which were thought of in the post-World War II situation tend to have shown their efficacy, and those measures have still not outlived their existence and importance, even though the world has moved far away from what is called, from 1945, it was in the middle of 20th century right up to 21st century. While the conflicts might have changed quantitatively, conflicts might have changed qualitatively in terms of the dimension, in terms of their coverage, in terms of the lethality of the weapons which are likely to be used in any conflict. These provisions seem to have hold up with as much strength as it was seen immediately in the post-1945 era. So here, in addition to, as we said, in addition to UN Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly, which is a deliberative body rather, and which is a policy-making body as well, and which tends to rather meet once a year, which is known as the UN General Assembly session, which is always held in September. But nonetheless, we find that the United Nations General Assembly tends to also, in their regular meetings, the UN General Assembly tends to act as a forum which tends to encourage the states to state their grievances against any other state, and which again by passing certain resolutions by passing certain decisions which are in the nature of UN resolutions tend to prevent any dispute between the states from taking a different and dangerous turn, and tend to be rather settled by the United Nations General Assembly in addition to UN Security Council. I think we all know that how United Nations General Assembly, in order to be able, in order to play the same, to fulfill the objective of the United Nations, that is maintenance of peace and security, tends to have also innovated certain measures, which is primarily known, which was done in the context of the Korean War in 1950, Uniting for Peace Resolution, which tends to have also contributed towards the maintenance of peace and security in our own world. So here, and we find that one of the most important and effective way that UN has been able to maintain the so-called peace and security in today's world has been largely undertaken through what is largely called preventive diplomacy and mediation. And that is where we find when we talk of the UN peace mission, UN peacekeepers, or if you talk of sending the UN Secretary General's representatives or special political missions to the so-called conflict-torn areas, these activities have been all undertaken under the gamut of which we call preventive diplomacy and mediation. And it has been very well known that any form of interstate or human conflicts tend to have involved massive human suffering and also huge economic cost, because the world realized as to how much the world tend to have lost in the Second World War. And in that context, because any conflict today, given the fact there is a military modernization which is going on side by side, economic reforms in various states in our world, and also given the fact that the states have been able to acquire more and more advanced lethal weapons, which tend to, including the nuclear bombs, which tend to have the capacity of reaching out to a much larger distance, and also which has the capacity to probably to kill, if it is dropped in a particular area, to kill many thousands and millions of people. If the nuclear bomb is dropped, the UN has taken upon itself that if at all, since these conflicts tend to involve huge economic cost and also massive human devastation, the loss of human lives, millions of human lives, the United Nations tend to have been very careful in undertaking certain activities, as has been laid out in the Charter, and tend to have also played an important role in keeping our world both after the end of the Second World War and also today up to the end of any conflicts. And we find that hence we find through preventive diplomacy and mediation, as the measures have been laid down in the UN Charter, tend to have played a very effective role in conflict prevention by deploying diplomacy. As you know, there are certain six tools of peaceful Pacific settlement disputes, or we call it peaceful settlement disputes, which are used by United Nations, by United Nations Security Council, and also by the General Assembly, where we find that they tend to have been carried out by deploying diplomacy, good offices, mediation, involving special envoys and political missions in the field, so to say, which have really proved their worth. But when we talk of the UN Charter, when you come to the global community, we'll only see the first part as to how UN has been empowered to do, and in the second part we'll see whether UN, given the fact that these provisions do exist in the maintenance of peace and security, whether these provisions are really going to be useful in the current day conflicts, or if they are not proving useful, what are the reasons? But nonetheless, since 76 years have passed, it's important for us to see that how United Nations has got the structural part totally determined by the UN Charter, and also how the UN has been playing the role. And then after having talked about it, we'll go to the second phase and we'll see what kind of global security threats are emerging in our present day world, and how UN has been, rather, as people say, tend to be ineffective in controlling those disputes. I'm not saying the word ineffective in the first part, because in the first part you will know that UN has been rather very effective up to, as we call it, up to the beginning of the Gulf War in 1991. But nonetheless, the first United Nations proved its worth immediately after, which was undertaken by UN by setting up its own office in West Africa, that is Senegal, in the capital city of Dakar. And there, since UN had the mandate to enhance contributions of the UN for establishment of peace and security in West Africa, United Nations quickly went to the conflict sites by setting up the office. It not only deployed its own forces, it also engaged in a preventive diplomacy and mediation measure, which tends to have promoted an integrated regional approach for advancing issues, which tend to have impacted the security of West African region. So we found that for the first time in West Africa, United Nations showed its efficacy in tackling the conflicts which were emerging in the whole West African region. I think Africa is another story. We will not be going much detail into it, but nonetheless, we need to remember that the West Africa tend to have been one of the first kind of a field where United Nations proved its worth, proved its efficacy, proved its efficiency in deploying preventive diplomacy and mediation techniques, which tends to have ensured that the region tends to maintain peace and tends to enjoy a secure environment, which was not possible without the so-called diplomatic measures. I think we also remember that whenever we talk of United Nations maintenance of peace and security, one of the most important things that comes to our mind is that the peacekeeping. We know that peacekeeping tends to be almost an activity which has been undertaken by United Nations immediately in those conflict areas which have proved to be rather less short-lived conflictual areas rather than and rather have had gone in for long duration conflict. And when there is the conflicts tend to have not been controlled very easily, the peacekeeping mission has been resorted to by United Nations, where it tends to have deployed the UN peacekeepers, who are known by the nomenclature of blue helmets, and also and these peacekeepers who have been contributed, the peacekeepers and the police, the army and the police, which have been to the member states, tend to have been deployed by United Nations in order to help its member states to adhere to the path of peace, to be present in almost all parts of the world, in almost all the conflict areas of the world, rather than being solely confined to its own UN headquarters, that is New York. I think when you talk of peacekeeping operations, why we talk of peacekeeping operations of being so forces tend to be involved in shows as to how much the United Nations tend to be looked forward to by the so-called weak and poor and insecure states for their own security and for the security of their own people who may have become part to the conflict which may be taking place in their own neighborhood. So here we find, and why peacekeeping operations tend to have become numerous, they tend to have become popular simply because it is told somewhere that presently the need of the hour, since the countries have undergone or gone through the so-called bloody conflicts which tend to have pushed the development process in these countries by many years than what it was normally expected. So, and we know that such activities, that the peacebuilding activities tend to have been carried on by the worldwide by United Nations in many parts of the world. And the other important thing that we know that traditionally the United Nations was expected to merely prevent the interstate conflict, which tend to be involving large number of each other's population in such kind of conflict. But we know that as terrorism has emerged in the later 20th century as a kind of a threat to the threat of breach of peace to the member states, and also tend to be leading often to the member states to an act of aggression against each other. The United Nations tend to have also played an important role. When you talk of United Nations, you need to remember it's the United Nations Security Council, which is the most important body. The continuing assembly of the United Nations tend to have also got involved in countering the terrorist threat to the member states, and has been able to come up with certain measures which certainly have proved to be helpful in tackling the terrorist threat of terrorism to the various member states who tend to be suffering from its ill effects over the period. So here we find that even when you talk, US has successfully become a coordinator or coordinated the global fight against terrorism. We have also seen after 9/11 and also after 26 September, we find that how the world has become a transformed world, and when the security was terribly under threat, it has been the state security and the people's security had become so much invulnerable that the United Nations, by stepping into the throne, by developing a consensus among its own member states, the terrorist threat certainly has been reduced. Why we are saying reduced? Because the whole threat of terrorism, as we can see in the context of Afghanistan, in the context of the West Asia and other parts of the world, including Europe and the United States of America, how the threat of terrorism still seems to be looming large, which was in the earlier period was thought of not to take place, not to become a threat to America or Europe or United Kingdom, as it has become so far. So here we find that the United, what you call it, between any two major power of the world, then the United Nations has found it so very easy so far in tackling the threat of the conflicts or threat of the breach of peace, and has been able to deploy the peacekeeping mission. As we saw, this was the story right up to 1990s, 1990, where probably the major power after the Second World War, although they were caught up in a kind of a Cold War situation, but there was no kind of a threat to the peace and security of the member states or to any of the superpowers, because superpowers were not trying to exercise the option of getting into any kind of conflict with each other. Although the Cold War simply is known as the Cold War simply because that although they had come to the brink of conflict, but certainly they did not get invested in a conflict or in a hot pursuit of war, which tends to have kept not only the world far away from the conflict, but also the United Nations system from being threatened with any kind of a negative effect which may arise from its major powers who are its members or who are its member states from getting into real conflict. I think why we talk of 1990s simply because the 1990s seems to have, while the Cold War seemed to have symbolized a kind of a particular threat which certainly had the possibility of getting translated into nuclear conflict. But in 1991 we found that with the engagement between Iran and Iraq, which led to Gulf War, and where the United States tend to have got involved in the Gulf War, which was later on discovered after the end of the Gulf War, which took place for about 8 years before it came to an end. We found that the United Nations, and when the United States also got involved in attacking Iraq, we found the real test or worth of United Nations system was for it, which simply showed some kind of ineffectiveness in preventing the United States from attacking a small state called Iraq. And that is where we find that the United Nations again after 1990s, United Nations again showed its worthlessness, simply because the United Nations did not act so very strongly to prevent the conflict which was taking place in Sudan. So there we find that the post-Cold War era, which led to another form of conflict between the smaller states, where at one point where a big power got involved, and where the big power was also not being able to be prevented from getting into any kind of a conflict with smaller states. The United Nations tend to have come in for a large amount of criticism for its own failure, for its ineffectiveness, otherwise for which it was being praised by the world community to a great extent. I think when you talk about these threats which you talked about, I think these threats were primarily in the nature of what we call it in international relations discipline, traditional threats. But then this traditional threat to security, to states normally arises out of the so-called war or warlike situation, which may originate in any kind of small conflict that may be interstate in nature. But then we find that this kind of a traditional threat of security was later on discovered by the analysts that the states not only suffer from such kind of a traditional threat to security only, that the states also, given the fact that there is globalization going on, the states also tend to be suffering from another kind of threats which were categorized as non-traditional threat to its own security, simply because all these threats to its security were not military in nature, which did not engage the military of both the countries. Rather it engaged the non-military sources, which gave it a name of non-traditional threat to security of states. And in this non-traditional security of states, we find that both the global security came to be challenged not only by the so-called traditional security of states, which tends to be always real, given the fact that the states do possess their potential or their power to carry on an act of aggression against any other state should their security be threatened. But then we find that the states also now tend to suffer from non-military threats or non-traditional threats to own security, which are categorized as arising out of the so-called global climate change phenomenon, irregular migration, which took place in the late 1950s, and also the transnational crime and human trafficking, which tend to be carried on in the guise of trafficking the human beings, or in the guise of the so-called opium trade, or as you call it, contraband and other smuggled items. We also find that the countries tend to also suffer from in the kind of some kind of a conflict from resource scarcity, and also largely, as we saw in our own life in the last 2 years, this thing is globalization tend to have reduced the whole world into a global village. These kind of threats, which were not thought of before in the context of the traditional notion of state security, tend to have also acquired bigger dimension, as this kind of non-traditional threat to security or non-military threat to security tend to have also acquired a larger than life dimension, which tends to threaten a larger percentage of people, rather than what would be the size which would be vulnerable should conflicts. And here they tend to pose a much more damage, a much more potential to devastate a much more bigger size of the people and also their well-being, and also tend to have security implications both for the communities and also as well for the states. It is not that the non-military threat only affects, while we should understand non-military threat is going to affect both the people and the states alike when these threats tend to become very, very real. In other words, if the effects are not mitigated, if the conflicts are not controlled, or as we call it, managed in a proper manner, there's a possibility that both states and state system and human communities would go in for a devastation, will go in for a kind of a much larger negative effect than what probably we can imagine in our own way. So here we find it has been pointed out that when the states are faced with a non-military threat or non-traditional threat to its own security, it has been pointed out that there seems to be an indelible link between development, peace, and security. Analysts tend to point out that because of the link that there exists between the peace, security, and development, non-military threat tends to arise because of lack of development in the whole country, or in certain or constitutional development in certain areas, and tend to threaten the whole human community in that particular country or in that particular area where the states may be sharing the same problem. So these non-military threats, as they lie beyond the traditional definition or their security threats, tend to be popularly known as non-traditional threats, which tend to have very, very different characteristics when we compare them with the so-called traditional threats. There are traditional threat to security, or as you call it, military threats, because the non-traditional threats tend to become these members very, very simply because that these conflicts tend to become almost stateless, simply because they are not limited to any state, since they tend to have the potential to impact more than one state where it will assume a crisis form. So they tend to be stateless in nature, and since they are not confined to any particular given boundary of any particular state. And these non-military threats tend to have acquired a much more larger dimension in the human mind, in our power of comprehension, simply because they also tend to be what we call it transnational. Transnational in the sense that their effects of such conflicts tend to spill over to the boundaries of more than one state, and hence they are no more remain a national threat. Rather, they tend to become transnational threat. The third important characteristic that is present in this non-traditional threat or non-military threat to security is its own non-military origins. As we know that non-military origin, that it tends to have an origin and tends to be originating in the so-called conflict that tends to exist between the human beings or human groups, and tends to have potential to take the whole society under its control, rather than what used to happen in the context of the so-called military conflicts. Here we find that traditionally it is believed that such security threats, as the threats are emerging, will come to know We'll come to see what kind of security threats are there. But when you talk of the non-traditional security, we find that these kind of security threats tend to be often emerging out of traditional threats tend to be emerging out of the acquisition of military power or military capacity. We find that non-traditional security tends to have nothing to do with the state's military capability, because even if a state has very advanced military weapons, yet we know that those military weapons will prove to be will not be able to prove its worth in order to tackle the non-military threat or non-traditional threat to security, simply because that tackling such conflicts do not require any military means for their resolution or for their, as you call it, for their mitigation or for their abolition from the state's boundaries. So here we find that. So here we find that in the current circumstances, in the current changed circumstances, we find that the non-traditional threat to security as they've emerged from climate change, from illegal migration, from transnational criminal activities which tend to be carried on in the world today in the nature of contraband trafficking of human beings, and also by the pandemic, we see that these threats tend to be not only resulting in the loss of life. When you talk of climate change, we find that because of the seasonal change, because of the kind of untimely explosion of volcanoes, and because of the other natural calamities, the natural disasters, both man-made disasters also, that the states tend to suffer a loss of life in the case of millions of its own population, and tend to be also contributing towards the increasing vulnerability of the various states which are existing in that particular region or in that particular area. So that way we find that how non-traditional threat of security as opposed to traditional threat of security tends to be almost like a double-edged weapon, double-edged sword, which not only results in the loss of life, it tends to rather involve a loss of life of a much more bigger size of population, and also tends to involve the state as well compared with the so-called military conflict. And here we find that not only the state stability, which is important for the increasing economic success story of the respective countries, the state stability tends to become more and more vulnerable with the emergence of this kind of double-edged non-military threats. It also tend to almost threaten the international system as well, and hence it needs to be controlled at the earliest. I think when you talk of non-traditional threat to security, as we are on the map, we have seen that how the non-traditional threats are, while the traditional threats of security have been controlled by United Nations activities for a long time, right up to 1990s, as we saw that the non-traditional threats of security tend to have proved to be intractable, tend to have become uncontrollable, given the fact that the conflicts tend to not remain confined to boundaries, not remain confined to any geographical area, and tend to get spread much faster than a military conflict, if at all it takes place between any two states. And here we find, I think, if we take up an example of the pandemic, we'll find that how the pandemic, which originated in the Wuhan province of China in December, tends to have spread up to 215 countries within a short span of 6 months. And that shows how the pandemic has not only covered such a huge number of states, and it has also taken under its control such a more than billions of population under its own control, and it has also showed its worth by causing enormous amount of loss and loss of life, livelihood, and also devastation of economies of various countries, which tend to have more long-term consequences for the human societies than what is now being primarily thought about. So this origin and fast spread of the COVID pandemic tend to have proved the salience of the non-military threats that are existing very much in our own neighborhood, in our own vicinity, and also tend to have permeated the dividing line that normally used to exist between the poor and the rich countries. So when we talk of pandemic, we find that no country tends to have remained safe. It has not only affected the poorer countries, it also has affected the so-called rich countries as well, where we saw, although the large number of loss of life was primarily in the poor countries, but we see America and Europe also has not lost much lesser than what the world might have lost in the south or in the other part of the world. So the pandemic tend to establish the state weakness and inability of the both rich and poor countries in terms of provision of public services, which probably could have protected the life of its own human beings. So it shows that the non-traditional threat tends to have exposed the inability of the state system, the so-called present-day state system, in tackling the non-military conflict and in the provision of various welfare services, which the states are supposed to provide to its own population for towards the protection of their the people's lives and also their property and happiness, so to say. So here we find that this the pandemic, which is in the nature of a non-traditional threat, tends to have also shown the effects of such non-traditional threats, capability and its capability to ravage the international system, in addition to the state system, in addition to causing damages to the states, and also causing large-scale loss of lives and also leaving undesirable consequences for a long time to come. Secondly, we find that this non-traditional threat tends to have also threatened the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, which the states are now trying to suffer from, and which has made them almost grope in the dark as to how to mobilize the required wherewithal of resources in order to be able to bring their own population, their own economy back to rails, and tend to be deteriorating into a worse situation with every passing day. Even if we find the pandemic only has killed people, but pandemic nonetheless has not only destroyed population, it's also, what is important, it is also destroying the whole socio-economic systems of almost all the affected countries, and which they are not able to mobilize resources to cope up with this effect. So here, why we talk a pandemic is because that even though United Nations tend to have played a kind of a very orthodox role in maintaining peace and security in the context of the so-called non-military threats, or we call it the traditional threats to security, the United Nations probably now is being called upon by the world community, as we've seen in the context of the pandemic, to probably devise some new measures in the context of tackling the non-military or non-traditional threats to security, which are arising out of the natural and also man-made disasters in the context of the daily lives of the people. So here, I think if we stop here, we find that, and if we move in the post-1990 phase for the interstate conflicts, we find that while we can take pleasure, after the end of the Gulf War, that there has been no real war, but we find that the states, various states, tend to have also, when they are in search of their supremacy over other states in the context of the traditional threat of security, tend to have not stopped from searching for allies or looking to acquire more and more influence over the other states' policies, and that seems to have also gave rise to the threat of military conflict, simply because that even after the dissolution of Soviet Union in 1991, we find, while the world is said to be a unipolar state where the US was the only superpower and trying to use its own hegemonic power or influence over the other member states, we find now that in the present time, the United States of America is now being challenged by the emergence of middle powers like India and China, where US tends to have been forced to relocate itself to the actual regions of influence, where it is not only involved in increasing its own power over its own allies or other member states of United Nations. It is also geared upon to check the rise of China, particularly in the Asian continent, as we say, Indo-Pacific region, or so to say, in the area involving Southeast Asia and particularly the Asian countries. I think it is believed that if at all there had been peace in the Asian region and also in Southeast Asia, which made possible for the rise of four tigers in terms of the advancement of the economy, which they now are said to be enjoying the so-called economic prosperity compared with what has happened, what is largely available in the United States of America and Europe. We find that with the US, with the rise of China and its rapid modernizing military program, and also by continuous activities of China over South China Sea, which tend to threaten not only the international trade and commerce, where 30%, more than 30% of the global community trade tends to take place, which are of great importance not only to the countries in the Indian Ocean region, but also to the advanced countries of the Western Europe. United States of America tend to have been not only forced back to adopt a policy which is known as rebalancing, using Asia as a pivot policy, or rebalancing US influence in Asia, where United States attention has been now drawn into the region, not only because of the rise of China and Chinese policies of escalation, and policy in nature of escalation of some kind of a war-like situation in the region, but also for the fact that the Southeast Asia region tends to have been or the whole of Asia tends to have been categorized as a kind of a Asian century, simply because that the World ADB has predicted that there will be something like an additional 3 billion population would be added to the so-called affluent middle class, which represents the size of a promising market, which can probably boost the economy of the other advanced countries. And that is how we find that Asia has tend to become a theater of so-called likely military conflict, because here we find that while China is trying to not only challenge United States in the ASEAN region, China is also seen to be challenging America in Africa and also in Europe and other parts of the world, simply because China is now trying to almost checkmate United States and trying to exercise its own control of not only being the world's almost growing richest economy. There's a difference that while we tend to call US a kind of a world's largest economy, but China is also almost touching up the American economic size, given the economic boom that China has been able to usher in within its own territory, and given the fact that US-China conflicts, the US-China differences tend to be reflected in the context of the Chinese announced policy of one world, one belt and one road policy, or as we call it in case of CPEC. We find that with the engagement of America and China, and particularly over that of Indo-Pacific region or in the so-called larger Asian region, we find that the so-called military threat, which was almost seemed to have been forgotten because of the United Nations activities through its preventive diplomacy and mediation measures, tend to be becoming much more real, which tend to threaten not only the security of the countries of the region and the population which tend to be residing in the region, but also of the whole world, simply because that both of them also happen to be nuclear power. Although there has been a talk of that there will be no fast use policy that US tends to demand from China, but there has been no sharp commitment on the part of China to not to be able to use the nuclear weapons should there be any conflict, where both the military of both the countries tend to be will be involved in any kind of a conflict. And we also understand that not only US-China tends to be threatening the US-China contestation tends to be one of the factor in the rapidly changing military situation in the region, but also Chinese policies toward its own neighbors, including India, where we see that there are repeated incursions of China across over Indian territories, which was seen in the case of Galwan, in the case of Eastern Ladakh, and we also see in other parts of the in other parts of the Indian territory, where we find that because of the Chinese aggressive designs, tend to also have attracted US attention, where the whole regional security of the Indo-Pacific region or in the Asian region tend to have become very, very vulnerable. And here the question is that if at all should there be any conflict, whether the United Nations will be able to meet these, will be able to tackle such conflicts when it becomes global literature, given the fact that both the world's two major powers would be engaged in a conflict, and since both the countries tend to have allies in the other parts of the world, should the United Nations be able to control this conflict, or it was again proved to be ineffective, as it proved to be ineffective in 1991 over that of Iraq attack on Iraq, or over that of the Sudanese question. Here the question is that we all know, if you look into United Nations structure, we know the United Nations tend to, in the Security Council, tend to have 5 major powers who have been given the veto power, and without these 5 permanent members' veto power consent, no decision can be carried on by the United Nations in the context of any kind of a conflict which tends to involve any of the 5 powers or any other major power. Given the fact that United States and China tend to be both enjoying the veto power, it has been seen that anytime any action or any resolution is passed by United Security Council or sought to be passed by United Security Council to control Chinese actions over that of extending support to Pakistan as far as terrorist activity, sending of or terrorist activities are concerned vis-a-vis that of India, or with regard to last support that is extended to the terrorist groups worldwide, or in terms of any other black money activities, we find that such decisions have not been easy to carry on by the United Nations, simply because China has always threatened to exercise veto power, which has proved any such resolution which is arrived at by the United Nations Security Council after great deliberation among the member states who are member of the UN Security Council to be very, very ineffective. So in other words, even if from this we can learn the lesson that UN can probably prove its worth when the small powers tend to be involved in any kind of a conflict, but UN tends to have exposed its own ineffectiveness when any of the major power tends to be involved in any kind of a conflict, military conflict, with any other state, which tend to be either non-permanent member of Security Council or tend to be rather a small landlocked power in the world that be. So that way we find that and this kind of a logjam, or this kind of a vulnerability of United Nations tends to draw our attention to the fact that probably the world had not thought about such kind of a situation when the United Nations in its own structure tend to have advocated for the grant of veto power to 5 major countries, and probably United Nations very plainly expected that these countries were all the countries would be able to exercise the kind of restraint, the kind of balances that are expected to fulfill the United Nations objective of maintenance, which will be useful for maintenance of peace and security, and would not be threatening United Nations existence or effectiveness in any manner, in any way or in any manner that would be totally against the UN Charter. But given the fact that there has been and we have read about Morganthau, that how the state politics tends to be rather based on much on realism rather than on any kind of idealism, it shows that probably United Nations had not reflected enough on the kind of realist attitudes which could arise out of the state behavior, and rather probably had gone in for some kind of idealism which tend to be proving its undoing in the present day times. And here I think in this context we know that when the global security challenges tend to be acquiring more and more dangerous form, where we find that US, China are not only involved in Asia, they are also involved in Europe and other parts of the world in terms of whether you call it a trade war or call it any kind of a in terms of the human elements. We find that the United Nations seem to have not paid adequate attention to such kind of a situation. In that context, we find that although the world has gone so far, and which has been much to the thinking of the United Nations as it evolved in 1945, we find that the demand for reforms of the United Nations system, which has been voiced by not only by the third world countries but also by some of the European countries who happen to be member of the United Nations system, tend to have fallen into the deep fear of the big powers who tend to exercise their veto power in United Nations and who are found to be using United Nations policies or decisions for their own vested interests rather than as they should be using it for the benefit of the whole humankind in order to be able to arrive at those decisions or passing resolutions which will benefit the whole world rather than any particular country. I think the world has seen that although there has been a demand by India and by other countries for grant of a permanent membership in the UN Security Council, yet we find that while we find all on a sudden or during various spate of events that the certain states tend to extend their support to either India's membership of the Security Council or any other country's membership. Where we talk of the Germany, they say that they can also be members of the Security Council, but we find that even United Nations reform has remained a far-fetched cry than what is expected in today's time when the world is really fraught with a very, very gigantic threat situation, which not only comprises of primarily which is known as military threat, but added to what is known as non-military threats. And given the fact that the non-military threats have become very, very real and tend to be acquiring much more larger dimension as we saw in the context of the pandemic, and also we are slowly witnessing in the context of the what is called that climate change phenomenon. It shows that if the United Nations system is not reformed as to be more representative of the today's nation-state system, which tends to consist of more than 192 countries, particularly in the UN Security Council, the United Nations probably would be suffering from a kind of a threat of its own collapse if it does not respond to the emerging global security challenges by its various policies and also by its power of persuasion of adoption of suitable actions by the member states to tackle or control the so-called non-traditional threats which are emerging primarily out of what we call it abominable human practices. I think where it is true that disasters tend to be natural in certain contexts, so to say, but much of the things we could see that much of the human activity tend to be contributing to a large aspect of climate change than what it is believed to be natural disasters. I think we know that floods have been a part of natural disaster, but the kind of land use changes and the kind of lifestyle and the kind of greediness which is part of a capitalist development system, which is largely being adopted by more and more states in the present day world, tend to be contributing to a larger degree of insecurity added by the man-made disasters, which tends to threaten the existence of not only the various states as the threats are borderless, it also tends to threaten the existence of the human race and as well as livelihood. Given the fact that these effects would be wiping out not only population, would also be denying the kind of livelihood opportunities to people who, in case they survive out of these man-made conflicts or non-military threats, the situation certainly tends to call for the adoption of a suitable mindset, which would be able to aid the United Nations reform processes to arrive at a decision much more faster than what it is being presently talked about. So I think when you talk about the global security situation and the United Nations, we know where our choices should lie. Our choices, instead of being totally located in the arena of idealism, will have to move on to the arena of practicality or practices where probably as the human beings tend to undergo changes, the international organizations do not have to, like United Nations, do not have to remain elephantine or do not have to remain as an unchangeable monument, rather than should be able to change its own policies and also its own structures so as to be able to be of usefulness to the humankind as it has been by carrying out the various activities primarily in the traditional sector of maintaining peace and security in our world so far. I think I will end it here. This is I should be ending it here. This is a global security. We could have gone into much more into e-security, but then that will require much more time. I think this is the kind of a thing we will not be able to spare time. You may, but then if there's another opportunity, we'll probably can talk of the various regional threats which are emerging from out of the regions, and also we could probably assess whether in each case whether the United Nations would be of some help or some other nation. But nonetheless, given the fact that the organization tends to exist, we should be able to demand and implement the changes which are necessary for the effective functioning of the United Nations, other than work or think of its collapse in any kind of a security situation. I think I must thank you once again for having given me the time and the platform for sharing my kind of a thought. And also, I will be very happy if you would be able to share your own ideas, your own concerns, your own questions as regard to the emerging global security scenario, and also the capability of the United Nations system in the present time, and its kind of capacity to be able to tackle those threats for the benefit of the humankind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm sure participants will have questions and comments to share, since sir has touched upon extensively on the United Nations from till the present time. Before I give time to anyone who wants to take time, I would just briefly wrap up what sir has just presented. He has started from the formation of the United Nations, the objective and the structural organizations, how these different organs have been playing an important role in international peace and security, and how the United Nations have achieved in many fields as well, and also went into to discuss the traditional and non-traditional aspects of security challenges, and the very important non-traditional security challenges that we are facing these days. In fact, he has also touched upon very extensively on how the United Nations worked on to bring peace, making peace and building peace. So nowadays, as we can see, that the United States is not only emphasizing on peacekeeping, but also peace making and peace building. So he has very well elaborated on all this aspect. Nowadays, is there some problem in my microphone? Or yeah, nowadays, I mean, right after the Cold War, in the post-Cold War, there was a question on the relevance of the United Nations. There had been a lot of talk. The States is still relevant. United Nations is still relevant or not? And in fact, like sir was mentioning about the permanent members in the Security Council, there has been a lot of talk on the restructuring of the United Nations, and we hope that one day, sooner or later, this restructuring happens, and suitable countries and candidates are also represented. The majority part of the people in the world are also represented in this important decision making. So good thing about the United Nations is that it gives us hope that we can live in peace. There is an organization that is working towards securing international peace and security. In fact, in spite of some of the limitations, you would find that United States, which was formed basically to prevent another world war, has been living up to its expectation. We have prevented very successfully the occurrence of World War III. In spite of many challenges. So we hope that countries come together to work for one better world. So with this, I would open the floor for discussion. If you have any queries or if you want to comment, you please take your time. I give the time to the participants.
Sir, I have a question, more like a comment, in fact, but of course a question. When the world hasn't been able to really tackle the counter-terrorism strategies, and the UN also hasn't been able to counter this terrorism problem in the world fully, or maybe much so. And then when we're still grappling with this terrorism problem, we have again started having these non-traditional threats from, as you said, from climate change or from the pandemic or from here and there, all the points that you have mentioned. So the old problems were not solved. Again, we were bombarded with more new. We are being bombarded with new, more traditional problems. So So I have this sinking feeling that, and with very big frankness, I believe UN has failed miserably. Actually, the old problems have not been solved, and again we are meeting these new problems. So, don't you think UN is in a very sad precipice, standing in a very sad precipice now?
So you are still muted.
Yeah. When we talk of United Nations, we need to understand that it is an interstate organization, and which is primarily based on the cooperation, or as you call it, due cooperation from the member states, for its own effectiveness. And when you talk about the failure of the United Nations, the failure of the United Nations can also be attributed towards the practices of the member states who, instead of trying to extend cooperation to the United Nations functioning, tend to often act to block the United Nations from carrying on any kind of effective measure when it feels that the world has probably come to the brink of a disaster. I think when you talk of terrorism, we have seen also that how even we have probably heard of FATF, and where even to keep or to label certain states in certain categories for having extended funding to terrorist organizations has become nearly difficult, and it is certainly so time consuming that certain other states tend to feel rather very nervous of. I think the effectiveness of the event can only be a fact of the life only when the states, instead of giving into their own, as we call it in our own discipline, powerful tactics, or in terms of in search of their own allies and power of influencing decisions of other states, do not try to block the function of the United Security Council or United Nations and extend their support, then only UN probably can be an effective organization. But I think I didn't use the word failure simply because if you use the word failure, it again becomes very idealist. I think we should also understand that the United Nations is simply a platform for airing of grievances of member states for a proper solution when it is debated and discussed under the auspices of the UN General Assembly or in the UN Security Council. But if the member states themselves do not try to come together for a collective solution and tend to become vulnerable to threats which are being exercised by the powerful countries, then it could be said to be a failure of the world state system rather than primarily United Nations, because it is only one of the other mechanisms which can probably aid in the resolution of the conflicts rather than rather than simply do it itself. So while there are many other organizations, we have also seen that the United Nations, besides United Nations, there are also other regional organizations which are also effectively playing a role in the resolution of the conflict and also in trying to bring about certain amount of peace and security in their respective areas. So that way, we should rather be little patient with the reform processes which are being demanded by the demanded by the other member states for the United Nations. And once these reforms are probably carried on effectively, then probably United Nations would prove to be a much more effective organization in the interest of the peace and security rather than what it is today. But then, having said this, one has to be also little careful in delineating the fact that whether the states, the present day powerful states, do really want the United Nations to be as effective as the vulnerable people are expecting it to be, or it is the otherwise true, or the reverse is true. So that choice is probably going to determine as to what will be the future of United Nations as the states tend to look forward to in achieving their own narrow self-interest rather than the world's interest, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Is there any more?
What about my students who have become teachers? We should also hear them saying. It is always interesting to hear these students say to the teachers in front of teachers that this is their view.
Okay, sir. First of all, thank you so much for the very elaborate and insightful talk. I have a very basic question.
Very good.
And I'd love to hear your perspective on this. BRICS, being an emerging economies and known for their significant influence on regional affairs, the prospect of BRICS on international security. What is your perspective on that?
Already we understand that, as we know that the regional organizations or regional cooperation emerged out of the failure of the United Nations in driving the global cooperation which was being expected by the member states. So, BRICS in that case also has emerged as a kind of a regional independent group of countries consisting of, as you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in order to be able to drive some kind of economic commonality in search of peace and prosperity and economic growth in the region. If we talk of BRICS, I think, and it's also being held that the birth of regional organizations like BRIC and, we have other kind of groups which have come up in other parts of the world also. Even in India, we have BIMSTEC and other things. But I think these activities tend to add towards the global cooperation that for which United Nations stands for, rather than they act against the United Nations. So that way, my take is that while these regional groupings tend to have proved their existence in terms of boosting economic growth and primarily in the context of import and export business and other associated economic growth mechanisms, we can also be taken as they have also strengthened the activities directed at global cooperation than having acted against it. I think more regional organizations can be said to be posing no danger to the existence of United Nations or to the UN policies. It is good that you are talking of BRICS and what about other organizations? Are you teaching higher there, Jessica?
Yes, very much. We have a separate paper on international organization also. Sir.
When I didn't hear you as a student, I could hear you as a teacher. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to hear from you again.
Kevi is here, Kevi. Kevi is not here anyway. I should not make it a class anyway. It's up to the moderator, Dr. Pintan Bang.
Okay, thank you for the question and the appropriate response. If there is more question, then we'll take one before we wind up. Okay, So, sir, you have covered so well. In fact, all over the areas. So, I think the participants are satisfied. From my side, as a last, I want to know your opinion on the role of India. At present. Are you satisfied with the role of India in the field of contributing to the United Nations, especially in the field of all the security challenges that you have mentioned?
Yeah, when you talk of India, I think the United Nations system is found to be praising India for having contributed to all the UN peacekeeping operations and for having extended its cooperation to all the UN policies. But India seems to be rather disappointed for the fact that it has not been able to overcome the kind of blocks which are coming up from the permanent member states in United Security Council in the direction of fulfilling the interests and the threats which are coming up from the so-called global terrorism or terrorist elements, where the India's sustained efforts in trying to blockade certain countries or blacklist to get certain countries blacklisted for having supported for having actively funded the terrorist activities has really drawn almost zero result. And that way, although India wants to continue with the United Nations system, and at no point India has expressed its displeasure in terms of withdrawal from the United Nations membership. India is looking forward to the fact that United Nations is probably the only forum where the global threats to security can be tackled much more effectively than what it is being sought to be emphasized by various powerful member states as to be solved bilaterally. Because India's take has always been multilateralism. Multilateralism, that it believes that by maximum cooperation from multiple number of states, probably any kind of a threat, whether it is a military threat to security or a non-traditional threat of non-military threat of security, these can be effectively tackled by the multilateral agency that is organization, that is United Nations, rather than by any kind of a bilateral mechanism which certainly does not have a kind of a honest purpose as could be seen in case of United Nations. So that way, I think India has been although India's demand for a permanent membership of a permanent seat in the Security Council has not been honored as yet, but yet India seems to have given its present look to the United Nations and tend to look forward to its effective functioning in the future, with or without India being appointed as a member of the Security Council.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's time to wind up our lecture. I want to take this time to thank our resource person for today, Dr. Biswat Mahapatra, for his time preparing and giving us an excellent lecture today. Even though today is only the third, we have preborn this UN anniversary lecture, which usually conducted on 24th. That is the day the United Nations officially launched, and which is declared as UN Day, because tomorrow is Sunday, and therefore we have preborn this. Even though we are few in numbers now, since subject matter itself requires special interest, therefore those are quality participants, and therefore I want to thank all the participants. In particular, I also want to mention our Arvind Laier has been here from the beginning. He's still here, and also HOD and Jamir for our resource person and bringing him to this time today, and also friends from different colleges, from different universities and institutes, and even non-academic professions as well. I also want to mention Mr. Nyanta Nguli for this proceedings live in YouTube. I want to thank the Information and Publicity Committee for always taking of this live casting. I thank and also thank all the participants for patiently listening and being a part of this program. Thank you for making this program a successful one through your participation. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
I think I must also thank you, Dr. Dikshit Bang, for being so very helpful in conducting the program, and also my own colleague, Dr. Amongla, who has taken time to organize the program. And I not only look forward to your future program, which is students of political science, and we should also be able to see that the college, your college, should gain more strength and should acquire more and more bigger form. Maybe one day it will be able to contribute much more by way of direct action, not only in terms of building of awareness amongst the students and teachers, but also in terms of the ideas which can come up from such deliberations. So much. I thank everyone here.
Thank you.